On my 65th birthday, my own daughter handed me a wrapped box in front of 20 guests standing in her living room. Inside that box was a one-way plane ticket. "Have a good flight," she said, smiling like she had just given me the best gift of my life. Her husband laughed out loud, right there in front of everyone, cake still on his plate. What none of them knew, what nobody in that house had any idea about, was that 2 months earlier I had inherited $30 million, and I hadn't said one single word about it to anyone. My name is Robert Whitfield. I'm 65 years old, and I spent most of my life fixing cars in a small shop in Aurora, Colorado. This is the story of what happened after that birthday, and what I did a week later that none of them saw coming. I need to back up a little so this makes sense. My wife Margaret passed away 3 years ago from cancer, and after the funeral, our house on Cherry Street felt too big and too quiet for one person. I'd walk past her sewing room every morning and just stand there for a minute, like the silence itself had weight to it. My daughter Dani lived 20 minutes away with her husband Craig and their 2 kids, Tyler and Emma, and she told me I shouldn't be alone rattling around in that old house. She said I should sell it and move in with them. That family takes care of family. I believed her, and honestly, I wanted to believe her, because Margaret was gone, and I didn't want to spend my evenings talking to an empty kitchen. So I sold the house on Cherry Street that spring. It brought in a good amount of money, and I used a big chunk of it, $180,000, to help Dani and Craig with the down payment on a bigger house on Willow Creek Lane, the kind of house with a proper yard for the grandkids. My old friend Gerald Hoyt, a lawyer I'd known since high school, drew up a simple promissory note for it, just so everything was clean and on paper, the way Margaret always insisted we do things, even between family. I moved into the finished basement, hung a few of my old tools on a pegboard down there just to feel like myself, paid them $600 a month toward groceries and utilities, drove Tyler and Emma to school most mornings, and never once asked for anything more than a place at the table. I even fixed up the basement bathroom myself over a couple of weekends, new tile, new fixtures, all out of my own pocket, because I figured if I was going to live there, I should make it feel like a real home instead of a storage room with a bed in it. I thought that was what family looked like. The first year in that basement was fine, maybe even good. The second year, things started to feel different, though nobody said anything directly. Craig would mention, almost as a joke while we stood at the kitchen counter, that the water bill had gone up since I moved in, like I was running the shower for an hour, instead of the 10 minutes I actually took most mornings. Dani was busy with her marketing job downtown, and always seemed tired when she got home, dropping her bag by the door and heading straight upstairs. Too tired to sit and talk the way we used to when Margaret was alive and used to keep the whole house talking over dinner. The grandkids were the one bright spot in all of it. Emma, who was 9, would climb down to the basement most evenings in her socks, sit on the old recliner and tell me every detail about her day at school, whether I asked or not. Tyler, 14 and mostly buried in his phone, still came to me when he needed help with his math homework, because I was better at fractions than either of his parents, and he'd sit at my little folding table until the numbers made sense to him. But between Dani and Craig, I started noticing something I couldn't quite name. I wasn't invited into conversations the way I used to be. I'd hear them talking low in the kitchen some nights, voices dropping when I came up the stairs for a glass of water. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief makes a man see shadows where there aren't any. I kept driving the kids to school. I kept paying my $600 every first of the month. I told myself that was enough to earn my place in that house. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, my phone rang with a Texas area code I didn't recognize while I was folding laundry in the basement. The man on the other end introduced himself as Dale Pruitt, an attorney in Houston, and he told me my brother Walter had passed away from a heart attack the week before, alone in his house, found by a neighbor 2 days later. I had to sit down on the edge of my bed when he said that part. I hadn't spoken to Walter in 15 years. We'd had a falling out back in the 90s over how to handle our father's care in his last years. Harsh words neither of us ever fully apologized for, and neither of us had ever picked up the phone to fix it. I always figured there would be time later. There wasn't. Walter had never remarried after his divorce, never had kids, and built a company called Whitfield Energy Services from almost nothing into a business worth tens of millions of dollars, providing equipment and staffing to oil operations across 3 states. Mr. Pruitt told me that as Walter's only living relative, I was the sole heir to his entire estate. the company, the real estate holdings, the investment accounts, all of it. He estimated the total value at around $30 million once everything was settled and the paperwork cleared probate. I sat in my truck in the driveway on Willow Creek Lane for almost an hour after that call, not moving, just listening to the engine tick as it cooled. I wasn't thinking about the money, not yet. I was thinking about a brother I'd lost twice, once to an argument neither of us ever fixed, and now for good. I didn't go inside and tell Danny and Craig. I didn't tell anyone. I just sat there in the quiet, grieving a man I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, trying to figure out what any of this meant. Over the next 2 months, I quietly handled things on the side, using the library computer some afternoons so nobody at home would ask questions. I hired a Denver estate attorney named Susan Byrne, a sharp, no-nonsense woman recommended by Gerald, and she helped me set up a trust to hold everything Walter left behind, kept separate from my day-to-day life on Willow Creek Lane. I didn't change how I lived in that house one bit. I still paid my $600 a month. I still drove the kids to school every morning at 7:15. I still slept in that basement under the same old quilt Margaret had made years ago. Part of it was grief, not being ready to think about spending Walter's money on myself. But part of it, if I'm honest, was that I wanted to see how my daughter and her husband treated me while they still believed I had nothing but my pension and a little savings. While going through the paperwork on Whitfield Energy Services with Susan one afternoon in her office downtown, I found something that stopped me cold. The company had a regional office right there in Denver, and one of the operations managers listed on the payroll sheet was Craig Marsh, my son-in-law. He had worked there for 6 years, and he had no idea that the company writing his paycheck now quietly belonged, through a trust, to me. Susan explained the ownership was structured privately enough that nobody at the Denver office would ever connect Robert Whitfield, the retired mechanic in the basement, to the new majority shareholder, listed only under the trust's name. I didn't say anything to Craig about it. I just folded that piece of information up quietly in my mind and kept living my normal life in that basement, waiting to see what would happen next. As spring turned into summer, the comments at home got sharper, less like jokes and more like decisions being made out loud. Craig started saying, in that half-joking tone people use when they mean something fully, that the basement would make a great home gym once I didn't need it anymore, usually while flipping through a fitness catalog at the kitchen table. Danny mentioned, more than once over dinner, that her friend Karen had just moved her own father into an assisted living community down in Florida, and how peaceful Karen said her house felt afterward, how much lighter everything seemed. She said it like she was just making conversation, but she said it 3 separate times in 1 month, and I wasn't imagining that pattern anymore. I noticed other little things changing around the house, too. My mail started getting left on the counter instead of handed to me at the door, the way Emma always used to do it. Dinner portions got a little smaller when I sat down late from picking up a prescription. Nobody asked me to family movie night anymore, not even Emma, though I suspect that one wasn't really her choice to make. Craig started leaving the classified section, folded open on the kitchen table, some mornings, real estate listings circled in pen, and I never once asked him who those houses were meant for, though I had a pretty good idea. My 65th birthday was coming up in June, and Danny told me she was planning something special, inviting the neighbors and Craig's parents over from Phoenix. I wanted to believe that meant they still cared. Some part of me, the part that missed Margaret and missed being someone's priority, chose to believe it anyway. Even with everything else I'd been quietly noticing for months, filing it all away without saying a word to anyone about any of it, by the time June rolled around, I had finished everything with Susan Byrne. The trust was fully in place, the company ownership was settled, and I had $30 million sitting quietly behind my name, without a single person on Willow Creek Lane knowing a thing about it. I felt something close to peace about all of it, whatever happened next. I had grieved my brother in my own way, handled his business the right way, the way he would have respected, even if we never got to say it to each other's faces, and kept living exactly the same simple life I'd always lived in that basement. Danny seemed genuinely excited about the birthday party that week, running around the house picking out decorations, ordering a cake from the bakery on Colfax Avenue that Margaret used to love, the one with the little sugar flowers on top. Craig's parents were flying in from Phoenix on the Friday before. A dozen neighbors from up and down Willow Creek Lane were invited, along with a couple of Danny's old college friends. Emma helped me pick out balloons at the party store, holding up different colors and asking which ones Grandma would have liked best, and that small thing alone kept my spirits high the whole week leading up to it. I helped set up the folding chairs in the backyard that Saturday morning, feeling something like hope for the first time in a long while, thinking maybe things really were about to get better between us, that this party was them finally remembering I was still their father, still part of this family, not just a line item in the monthly budget. I put on my good blue shirt that evening, the one Margaret always said brought out my eyes, combed what was left of my hair, and walked into that living room, ready to celebrate turning 65, surrounded by people I loved. The party went fine for the first hour. People ate cake off paper plates. The grandkids ran around the yard, chasing the neighbor's dog. Craig's father told the same fishing story he tells every single time I've ever been in a room with him. Then Danny stood up in front of everyone near the fireplace and said she had a special gift for me, something she'd been planning for weeks, her voice bright and pleased with herself. She handed me a wrapped box, and the whole room went quiet, watching me untie the ribbon. Inside was a one-way plane ticket to Ocala, Florida, along with a glossy folded brochure for a discount senior living community, the kind with a stock photo of smiling strangers playing cards on the cover. "Have a good flight," Danny said, still smiling, explaining to the room that she thought it was time I lived somewhere with people my own age. Somewhere I could really relax instead of being cooped up in a basement. Craig laughed out loud, actually laughed, and said something about finally getting his home gym, like he'd been waiting a year to say it. A few of the neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their folding chairs. Nobody said a word in my defense, not even Craig's mother, who at least had the decency to look at her plate. I looked down at that ticket for a long moment, feeling the thin paper between my fingers. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I folded it carefully along its own crease, thanked Danny for thinking of me, and told the room the cake was excellent. Then I walked downstairs to my basement room, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at that folded ticket for a long time, thinking about Margaret, thinking about Walter, thinking about $30 million sitting quietly in a trust. Nobody in that house knew existed. I didn't say goodbye to anyone that night. Once the last guest left and the house went quiet, I packed one duffel bag with a few changes of clothes and my important papers, the folder Susan had given me, and I walked out the front door around 11 o'clock without turning a single light on. I didn't slam the door. I didn't leave a note on the counter. I just left, the same quiet way I'd been living in that basement for 3 years, except this time I knew, standing on that front porch, that I wasn't coming back. I checked into a Marriott downtown near Union Station and sat on the edge of the hotel bed with my phone in my hand, the ticket still folded in my shirt pocket. I called Gerald Hoyt, waking him up a little after midnight, and told him everything that had happened at the party, every detail, right down to Craig's laugh. Gerald was quiet on the line for a moment after I finished talking. Then he reminded me of something I'd half forgotten over the years, that the note for the Willow Creek Lane down payment had a clause in it. The $180,000 was set to be forgiven at $18,000 a year, but only as long as I was living in that home and being treated as family in good faith. Otherwise, the full remaining balance was due on demand with 30 days' notice. I sat with that information for a long time that night, looking out the hotel window at the Denver skyline, lit up against the dark. I wasn't angry, not in the way people usually think of anger. I was just done being surprised by things I should have seen coming for a year. The next morning, over a cup of hotel coffee that tasted like nothing, I called Susan Byrne first and told her I was ready to fully step into everything Walter had left me. No more waiting around. Then I called Gerald and asked him to prepare the paperwork on the promissory note. There was still $144,000 remaining on that loan, and I told Gerald I wanted a formal demand letter sent, calling the balance due in full within 30 days, exactly as the note allowed under its own terms. Gerald asked me if I was sure, if I wanted to think it over for a few more days before he filed anything. I told him I'd had 3 years to think it over, and one plane ticket to Florida had made the actual decision for me the night before. This wasn't about hurting anyone for the sake of it. It was about a piece of paper they had signed years ago, with clear conditions attached, and those conditions were no longer being met by anyone in that house. I also learned from Susan that Whitfield Energy Services had already been planning, long before Walter died, to consolidate its smaller regional offices, folding the Denver operations into a larger Salt Lake City branch to cut costs. It had nothing to do with me, and nothing to do with Craig personally, just a business decision moving forward on its own schedule that the old board had been discussing in quarterly meetings, since before I ever knew Walter's name was attached to any of it. I made a decision that morning that I wouldn't step in to stop it, and I wouldn't step in to save Craig's job either. I wasn't going to use my new position to hurt him on purpose, pulling strings just to watch him suffer. I just wasn't going to use it to protect him anymore either. Not after that ticket, not after watching him laugh while I stood there holding it in front of 20 people. Exactly 1 week after my birthday, a process server knocked on the door at Willow Creek Lane at 10 in the morning and handed Danny a certified letter demanding repayment of $144,000 within 30 days. My phone started buzzing on the hotel nightstand within the hour, call after call. I let the first 4 go to voicemail while I finished my coffee at the hotel restaurant downstairs, watching the traffic move along the street outside. When I finally picked up, Danny's voice was shaking, asking me what this letter meant, saying there had to be some kind of mistake, that lawyers don't just show up at people's houses. I told her calmly that there was no mistake, that Gerald had drawn up that note years ago exactly the way she and Craig had signed it, with conditions attached about how I was treated while I lived there. I told her the terms of that agreement hadn't been met, so the balance was simply due, plain and simple, nothing personal about the timing of it. She asked how I could do this to my own daughter after everything I'd given them over the years. I reminded her, gently but clearly, that everything I'd given them had come with a piece of paper attached, drawn up by a real lawyer, signed by both of them at that same kitchen table, sitting in a filing cabinet for years waiting to matter. She went quiet on the line for a moment, and I could hear Craig's voice somewhere behind her, muffled, asking who she was talking to. I told her I loved her, and I meant every word of it, but that loving someone doesn't mean letting them hand you a one-way ticket out of their life in front of 20 people and expecting absolutely nothing to change afterward. Then I told her I had somewhere to be, told her I'd talk to her soon, and hung up the phone gently, sitting there for a minute afterward just listening to the quiet of the hotel room. 2 weeks after that letter arrived, the restructuring at Whitfield Energy Services moved forward exactly as the old board had already planned it months earlier. The Denver office got folded into Salt Lake City, and Craig's position as regional operations manager was eliminated along with 4 others in a standard company-wide reduction, announced in an 11-minute meeting on a Friday afternoon. Craig had no idea, and still doesn't fully know to this day, that his father-in-law had become the majority owner of the very company that just let him go. He came home that Friday and told Danny he'd lost his job. 6 years of steady work gone in less time than it takes to eat lunch. Between that news and the demand letter for $144,000 sitting on their kitchen counter, the pressure in that house on Willow Creek Lane became something they couldn't quietly ignore anymore. Something that showed up in Danny's voice every time she called me that weekend. Danny called me twice that Saturday, and I let both calls go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say to either of them yet, and I wasn't ready to pretend I did. Gerald told me later that they'd tried talking to their bank about refinancing the house to cover the note. But with Craig suddenly unemployed and no new job lined up, nobody wanted to extend them fresh credit. The house on Willow Creek Lane, the one my $180,000 had helped them buy in the first place, was now the only real asset standing between them and that debt, and everyone in that house knew it by then. Craig apparently spent that whole week sending out resumes at the kitchen table, the same table where Danny had unwrapped that box just weeks earlier, and Gerald said the mood in that house had shifted from confusion to something closer to real panic once the reality of both problems landed on the same week. About 3 weeks after the party, Danny showed up at my hotel unannounced on a Tuesday evening, standing in the lobby looking like she hadn't slept properly in days, her coat still buttoned wrong. She apologized, actually apologized, saying she never should have handed me that ticket in front of everyone, that it was more Craig's idea than hers, and she went along with it because she was tired and stressed about money and just wanted the basement back. She asked if there was any way I could forgive the loan, or at least give them more time now that Craig didn't have a job to fall back on. I listened to all of it without interrupting, letting her get every word out. When she finished, I told her I appreciated her coming to say that, and I meant it. But I told her the truth too, that for 3 years I had felt more like a tenant paying rent than a father living with his own family, and that the birthday party had simply confirmed what I'd already started to suspect for months before it happened. I told her I wasn't trying to punish her, but I also wasn't going to pretend that CP taper didn't exist, just because things had gotten hard for them all of a sudden. Through Gerald, I agreed to give them an extra 30 days on the repayment deadline. Nothing more than that. I didn't forgive the debt. I didn't call anyone at Whitfield Energy Services to try and get Craig his old job back. I told Danny that some things a person has to work through on their own. The same way I'd had to figure out my own life after that party, alone in a hotel room at 65 years old with nobody checking on me. By early fall, I had bought myself a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet part of Denver near Washington Park. Paid for in cash, nothing flashy, just comfortable, with a back porch that got good morning light. I reconnected with a few old friends from my years running the auto shop, guys I hadn't sat down with in ages, and we started having coffee together, most Thursday mornings at a diner on South Pearl Street, trading old stories the way we used to before life got busy and complicated. It felt good to be somewhere I wasn't paying rent for a place at the table. I also went back to Susan Byrne and set up a separate education trust, funded directly for Tyler and Emma, money that would go straight to their college tuition someday, completely outside of anything Danny or Craig could ever touch or control themselves. I wanted my grandkids taken care of properly. I just didn't want that care running through people who had shown me exactly what they were willing to do, the moment things got inconvenient for them. One evening in October, my phone rang, and it was Emma, calling from Danny's cell phone, her voice bright and rushed the way 9-year-olds talk when they're excited. She just wanted to tell me about a school project she'd finished on the solar system, not asking for anything, not knowing anything about lawyers or demand letters or lost jobs. She just missed her grandpa and wanted to talk about Saturn's rings for 20 straight minutes. I sat on my new back porch listening to her go on. And for the first time since that birthday party, I felt something in my chest loosen, just a little, remembering that not everyone in that family had seen me the way Danny and Craig had. Willow Creek Lane went on the market that November. Danny and Craig couldn't refinance it and couldn't cover the note any other way, so they sold it, paid off what they owed me in full, and moved into a smaller 2-bedroom apartment closer to Craig's new job, a lower-paying position he eventually found at a smaller logistics company across town. I didn't gloat about any of it. I didn't call to check on how the sale went or ask about the new apartment. Gerald handled the final paperwork quietly, and that was the end of that particular chapter between us. Danny and I talk now, every couple of weeks, careful conversations over the phone. Nothing like what we used to have back when Margaret was alive and keeping us all close, but something real. Something honest at least. She's never once mentioned Florida or that plane ticket again, and I've never brought it up either, and I don't plan to. I still see Tyler and Emma regularly, on my own terms now, picking them up for dinner some Sundays at the diner on South Pearl Street, and Emma still calls just to talk about her day, not because she needs anything from me. I sit on my back porch most evenings now. In the house I bought with my brother's money and my own hard-earned peace of mind, watching the light change over the trees near the park, and I think about how strange it is that losing Walter, a brother I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, ended up teaching me more about who truly wanted me around than 3 years of living under my own daughter's roof ever did. I'm not bitter about how things turned out, and I don't spend my evenings replaying that birthday party, looking for something to be angry about. I'm just finally, for the first time in a long time, exactly where I want to be, in a home that's mine, with people around me who actually want to be there.